Welcome to the Money Answer Show with host Jordan Goodman. Whether you are starting out, deep into your retirement, or somewhere in between, the Money Answer Show has the know-how to help you. Now here's your host, Jordan Goodman.
Welcome to the Money Answer Show. This is Jordan Goodman, your host. My guest this hour is Bill Ginn. He is a business strategy consultant who used to be the Chief Conservation Officer at Nature Conservancy. He's also the founder of what's called NatureVest, which helps people invest in nature for profits as well. He's come out with a new book called Valuing Nature, a Handbook for Impact Investing. Welcome to the Money Answer Show, Bill.
Hey, thanks, Jordan. Glad to be here.
Just give us I gave you a brief idea, but just give us a brief history of your work as it's come to this level today.
Well, so for a long time, the Nature Conservancy has been focused on improving the quality of nature across the world. And a while ago, we came to the conclusion that just thinking about this as something that you can do from philanthropy alone, from charity, was not going to be sufficient in order to solve the immense problems that we face across the world. And so for that reason, we began to work with the private sector, looking for ways to engage them in our mission, which is to protect nature across the world.
Okay, so let's just start a little bit with the problem. I mean, people think about climate change, but how is it really going to affect people? I mean, maybe hurricanes are a little bit worse, but what is the real life impact on people with climate change and what's happening to nature today?
Yeah, well, that's really the central question here. And let me first say that, a lot of people, when you say nature, what they think of is a park, or maybe they think about birds or tigers or elephants. And, of course, those are very important parts of nature. But really what I'm talking about here are the fundamental natural systems that really drive the world. And in every case, we are experiencing some really serious challenges. For example, fresh water. Fresh water comes from nature, of course, from rain, from runoff, and fundamentally, over 1 billion people in this world don't have enough of it. So that system is under great stress. Soil for agriculture. We don't think of necessarily as agriculture as nature-based, but in fact, everything that we grow is grown in the soils of this world, and those soils are decaying all across the world. We're using up the organic matter, we're depleting them, they're reducing in productivity, so that's important. The world's oceans are under constant threat, not only from pollution, but from overfishing. More than 80% of the world's fisheries, for example, are in the decline or already severely depleted. And over 2 billion people get some portion of their daily protein from the ocean. So that's a huge issue. So climate change, you mentioned that right up front. Obviously, it's very important. If you look at where people live on this earth, they live in places which have, good rainfall, good soils for agriculture. And as we see climate changing, those patterns of precipitation, those temperatures are changing as well, and that's changing how hospitable those places are to people. And, of course, we have things like sea level rising, which, as we live mostly on the coasts of the world, those represent huge challenges for literally billions of people. So all those issues are just huge challenges that face civilization, and they're not optional. It's not something, we can deal with it later, because already we see the stresses that are impacting the fundamental systems of productivity across the world. So I'd be very sad if there weren't elephants or tigers or biodiversity in that sense, but really I'm talking about something that's much more fundamental and underpins all of those systems and are absolutely important to survival of life on Earth by human beings.
So most people would think these are massive issues. It's beyond anything I can do. This is something left to governments. We had the Paris Accord on climate change. We pulled out of it, but all the other countries of the world have agreed on that. So it's something that's done at the kind of big governmental level. You're taking a different approach. You're saying this is something that the way people invest can actually have an impact on it. How is that realistic compared to it? It just seems like such a big problem for most people.
Yeah, well, first, let's just say that, government alone is not going to be able to solve this problem. I mean, the amount of money that government has, even as we, face the trillions of dollars that we're having to divert to address the pandemic, we realize how fragile our ability to spend government money really is. So if you really think about where the resources are to solve some of these problems, you have to think about how we engage the private sector. And so my message is that in order to solve these problems, getting the private sector to be part of the solution is absolutely critical. Now, that obviously includes individuals, all the way to big corporations. So if you're a small investor and you're sitting there and you're wondering what I could do, well, there's a lot you can do. I mean, you can buy a photovoltaic system for your house. You can use an electric car. You can walk rather than ride. You can source your food from organic sources that are reinvesting in the soil of the world rather than depleting the soil of the world. So as an individual, you can take personal responsibility for this work. But as a business sector as a whole, this is an extraordinary opportunity, and it, in my view, is one of the amazing entrepreneurial opportunities. Inventing solutions to these problems and solving these problems is, in my view, is sort of at the same scale as the Industrial Revolution. I mean, if you think about the industrial... Go ahead, Jordan.
I was just saying, in your book... Go ahead.
If you think about the Industrial Revolution, it was a time in which we changed, all the sources of energy, how people worked and lived in cities, and all those same conditions are actually present today. In the next 50 years, we're going to change how we source energy, how we transport, goods and services. We have to completely redo how we manage water, how we grow our food. It took us roughly 400,000 years of agriculture. That's about 20,000 generations of farmers to create the food system that we have in the world today. That's how long people have been growing food. In the next 50 years, we need to double the amount of food that we have available. So 400,000 years to get to where we are, and in the next 50 years, we have to totally transform how we grow food. These are not optional things. These are just fundamental to the reality that, we have 7 billion people on Earth, and we're going to have 10 or 12 billion people on Earth, and we're already straining those systems.
You talk in your book about the difference between donors and investors. I mean, typically what you're talking about is considered a charity, like the Nature Conservancy where you worked for so long, that you give some money to a charity and they kind of take care of it. That this is not something that corporate America is going to really make any major impact on. What is the difference between shifting from a donor approach to this to an investor approach to tackle these problems?
Well, I think the difference is it's where the resources is in the private sector. So, we need the private sector to be looking at this as one of the greatest business opportunities in the history of the world, and to get behind that kind of investment and development. Without those resources there, you're darn right, there's no way that a charity can change how the world functions. They can do research, they can demonstrate, but really, we're talking about how you change how you grow food, how you use cars, how you fish. All of these things are controlled by the private sector, and we need the private sector to be changing how they service those activities so that we can actually have an outcome that is sustainable for the entire planet.
So for somebody in the private sector to want to go into this, it has to be profitable. Otherwise, they're not going to do it. Then it becomes a charity or a hobby of some kind. So, and people would typically say, when you do something that's profitable, it's more costly to do organic gardening is more costly than traditional. How can you make this transformation profitable so companies have a incentive to go and invest in this area?
Well, there's some great examples of where we have used public policy and incentives on the part of government to encourage people to invest in the things that we need to have them invest in. Let's take solar energy, for example. Solar today in most parts of the world is cost competitive with coal, with oil, with conventional sources of fuel. It didn't used to be that way. It took public policy, tax credits in many cases, subsidies and grants to build the solar industry to the state that it is today. But it's arrived. And we now see that that investment is paying off because these renewable alternative sources of energy are cost competitive compared to the non-renewable sources of energy. So that's an example of a win. Let's take electric cars. The most valuable car company in the world is not General Motors or Ford Motor. It's Tesla, the electric car maker. So investors who are taking risks, who are entrepreneurs, yes, in some cases we've made, subsidies and incentives to encourage people to make investments with them in order to advance their causes, but they are showing the way. And it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that you have these big companies like Ford and General Motors who have less value today on the stock market than companies like Tesla, who are basically startups. But that's what, entrepreneurs are doing. They're transforming these systems, often, at the expense of companies who haven't been able to pivot as fast or, haven't made the investments that's required. And that's the great thing about the private sector, is that they can be successful.
Very good. We're going to take a break. This is Jordan Goodman of the Money Answer Show. My guest for this hour is Bill Ginn. He's a business strategy consultant. He was formerly at the Nature Conservancy, where he was chief conservation officer. He has also founded NatureVest, which is a partnership with private investors that's invested over $200 million into conservation projects worldwide. And is also the author of a new book called Valuing Nature, a Handbook for Impact Investing. We'll be back after this.
You've been listening to the Money Answer Show with Jordan Goodman. If you have a question for Jordan or his guest, please call us now at 866-472-5790. That's 866-472-5790. Now back to Jordan.
This is Jordan Goodman of Money Answers, the Money Answers radio show here. My guest this hour is Bill Ginn, a business strategy consultant who worked for a long time at the Nature Conservancy, and then he founded NatureVest, which is a partnership with private investors that's brought in over $200 million into conservation projects worldwide. He's the author of a new book called Valuing Nature, a Handbook for Impact Investing, which is published by Island Press, which you can hear about at islandpress.org. Welcome back to the show, Bill.
Thank you, Jordan.
So I want to talk about NatureVest a little bit. So tell us again what it was that you saw the need for this that wasn't being done before, and tell us a little bit about what it's accomplished since it was started. I guess it was in 2014 or so. Is that right?
Yeah. So, we have a problem here. We talk about all these huge issues that are facing the world, from water to energy to loss of biodiversity, the loss of forests, and to solve for that problem requires billions, if not trillions of dollars. And in order to have an impact at a scale that really will matter to those problems, the Nature Conservancy, I think, wisely said, we have to think about where the money is and where we can create partnerships that will have an impact at a scale that will actually matter to these kinds of issues. So that was the genesis for thinking about looking for formal ways to partner with the private sector. And to do that, we created an entity called NatureVest to formalize that work and make it a priority of the organization. And it becomes now, a major part of how we think about and operate our business is thinking about how we can create partnerships that leverage the private sector for the work that we think needs to be done.
So you got funding from J.P. Morgan Chase, the Grantham Foundation, and the Robertson Foundation. So big investors, kind of as a donation. This was not a profitable investment for them. Is that correct? So I guess the question, if you're trying to do a profitable investment, is there any way individual investors can support the same causes through NatureVest, or are there other ways for them to follow the lead of these big companies?
Well, so first, of course, yes, the foundation investments came from big companies who I think saw the same vision that we saw, that, like just take J.P. Morgan, they represent wealthy people across the world. They have investors. And a frequent question they had is, can't I invest in something that will help save the world? It seems like a simple question, maybe even a naive question, but there are a lot of people out there who are asking tough questions about, by making my investments, by buying a mutual fund, by buying a stock or a bond, is that, just making money at the expense of the world? And so they had a lot of issues and concerns about how they transform their business into thinking about services that would allow their customers to feel good about the investment work that they're doing. So they started with charitable donations from their foundation supporting this idea, as did the Robinson family and the Grantham family, both prominent investors, because they wanted to see whether or not we could attract private capital to these important impact-focused areas. And I think the answer is, definitely yes. I mean, we're now actually, since the book is written, up over $1 billion of investments around this general theme of investing in nature for global outcomes, for positive outcomes for people, but also in a way that will make returns for those investors. Because people, they need to retire. They need investments for their 401k. They need other ways of investing besides just giving money away for charity. And so creating platforms that people can invest is critical to getting the resources that we need in order to solve these problems.
So tell us more about that $1 billion. Is this coming? This is investment capital. This is not donations. This is not charity.
Exactly.
Are these mutual funds? Are these companies? Are there ways individuals can invest to become part of that $1 billion? How does all that work?
Yeah, so these are not, retail investments where I can take, $10 or $20 from my paycheck and put it into, one of these projects. Sadly, I mean, that's work ahead, is how do we make, the everyday investments that we make, as individuals and not as, super wealthy people or as corporations be at the center of the future here. So that's work that needs to be done. But, the investments are around things like water. Let me just give you a couple of examples. In the case of water, around 80%, and in some places as much as 90% of the water is used by agriculture. In a lot of those places, the use of that water is not very efficient. There are better irrigation techniques, there's sensors, there's computers, and that requires capital investment. In most cases, if you're a farmer and you make those investments, there's no way particularly to recoup your investment because you don't take the water out of the river and it flows down the river to, your neighbor who says, thank you very much for giving me that extra water. And you may feel good about that, but who's going to pay for your high-tech irrigation system? So the investment in water is about investing in ways to increase the efficiency of our water use, and that's primarily about agriculture. And increasingly across the world, governments are creating water rights that are transferable and tradable. So a farmer can think about making an investment, improving the efficiency of water use in their farm, and then if they have extra water, sell that water to their neighbor or to a city. So literally, tens of millions of dollars are now flowing from funds that the Nature Conservancy has sponsored both in the U.S. and in dry countries like Australia to help farmers invest in improving the efficiency of their systems so that there's more water for everybody. And the return on investment for those members of those funds is by being able to trade that water to somebody else and get paid for it. This is huge, and it's going to be absolutely central to the future of improving water use across the world, is helping agriculture invest in efficiency. It pays for them, but it takes capital, it takes resources, and you need government policy to support the kind of market creation, if you will, that makes it worthwhile for those farmers to make that investment, because when they make that investment, they're able to recoup it by selling those water rights to somebody else. So what we've essentially done is financing that transition to new water outcomes.
One of the other things you talked about doing was creating replicable business models that are helpful up to the earth, but also profitable. Can you give me an example of a business model you helped to find that could be replicatable?
Yeah, here's a great example. We started a company in Washington, D.C. That is creating green solutions to stormwater runoff. Now, what is stormwater runoff? Well, when it rains in a city, all that water falls on pavements, and typically it goes into sewers. The problem is that because it's such a huge flux of water at one moment, it just overwhelms our wastewater treatment systems in most parts of the world. And when it overwhelms those systems, they basically have no choice but to, open the treatment plant up and flood the natural waterways with polluted waters, because there's no place to store the outcomes. So our theory was that you could invest in green infrastructure in cities, green parking lots that absorb rainwater runoff rather than just shed it into a sewer, green roofs, improved parks that trap and store water and feed back into the groundwater. So our first attempt at this was in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has a unique feature of their stormwater law, which says that every new business has to make provisions for stormwater falling on their business. And they also allow those businesses to make investments off their site. So, our business idea was simply this. Let's find places where collectively we could make major investments in reducing stormwater runoff using green roofs, green parks, and thereby reduce the cost that these businesses would face to try to solve this problem on their premises alone. And the result of that was DC Stormwater Inc., which is a neat little company that's first projects have actually been in partnership with the Catholic Church. You know, if you think about churches have, huge parking lots that only get used a few times a week.
Right.
They also have things like cemeteries and, other places that, have a lot of, urban spaces used by those churches. So our idea was simply, let's go to these churches who are getting taxed, by the way, in all these urban areas by the amount of pavement they have, and look for ways to transform their sites to be net absorbers of stormwater rather than a source of the problem. So the Catholic Church is our first partner here. They have a huge cemetery in just the right place in Washington, D.C., in the southeast of Washington, D.C. That's an old Revolutionary War cemetery. It's huge in size. And many years ago, to reduce maintenance, they did a lot of paving and eliminated a lot of grass. Well, it turns out that's exactly the worst thing to do. And so they need to rip up all of that pavement. They needed to install ways to trap green water and convert that site into a place that absorbs stormwater. So what we did was we invested millions of dollars to transform that site into a place that absorbs stormwater. And then we went to local businesses and said, well, look, you've got a problem. You've got to pay for your stormwater, but you could join us and buy stormwater credits through this system and be part of a green solution for your stormwater. And that's now a very successful business, and that concept is growing all across the U.S., where people are thinking, wow, this has a double bottom line for us. We get to invest in creating parks, in greenways and more trees, and at the same time, we're solving a big pollution problem. What's not to like about that? So that's an example of a great little business that has been founded in Washington, D.C., and is poised, I think, to grow across the entire country.
Excellent.
And by the way, another break. Two or three other companies who've started doing exactly this thing, which is what's replicable.
Excellent. We're going to take a break. This is Jordan Goodman of the Money Answer Show. My guest this hour is Bill Ginn. He was formerly the Chief Conservation Officer at Nature Conservancy. He founded NatureVest, which we were just talking about, and he's the author of a new book called Valuing Nature, a Handbook for Impact Investing. You can find out more about it at nature.org, or his publisher is Island Press at islandpress.org. We'll be back after this.
You've been listening to the Money Answer Show with Jordan Goodman. If you have a question for Jordan or his guest, please call us now at 866-472-5790. That's 866-472-5790. Now back to Jordan.
Welcome back to the Money Answer Show. This is Jordan Goodman, your host. My guest this hour is Bill Ginn. He was the former Chief Conservation Officer at the Nature Conservancy, and he helped found NatureVest, which is a partnership with private investors that has brought about $1 billion into investment into conservation projects worldwide. He just came out with a new book called Valuing Nature, a Handbook for Impact Investing, which you can find out about at his the website for the publisher, islandpress.org. And the way to find out more about NatureVest is at nature.org. Welcome back to the show, Bill.
Thanks, Jordan.
So a very big trend these days is so-called ESG investing. I guess that's environmental, social, and governmental. How does that movement, there's a lot of money moving into those kind of fields, how does that work along with what NatureVest is doing in this whole investing in nature idea?
Yeah, I think it's totally supportive. I mean, you've asked some really good questions about how, just ordinary people can make sure that, they're doing the things that they can do to put their money to work in ways that support nature and support causes that are important to them. And, the way to do that is to understand the companies that they're investing in and what their ESG track records are. Almost every major corporation now is publishing reports about what their outlook is, what their impact on the world is, and it's an opportunity for all of us to get educated and to use our little marketplaces, the stocks that we put in our pension funds and that we buy for our kids' graduation, college funds, to put that to work in ways that companies actually are accountable for the impacts that they're having in the world. Now, just because everybody reports doesn't necessarily mean that, the outcome is good, right? So you need to differentiate between people who are reporting and people who are really making changes in their business to drive for, the kind of world that we want to see.
What kind of lessons should we take from the coronavirus, which actually started from wild nature, from, I guess, wild animals at that farm in Wuhan, or the market in Wuhan, and spread around the world, and has killed hundreds of thousands of people, and all of the devastation it's done. What can we learn from the spread of the coronavirus about your movement for investing in nature?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, first, you're absolutely right. The origins of this was the wildlife trade. If we weren't illegally trapping and using wildlife for these purposes, and even China now has banned these practices, if we weren't doing that, then we would dramatically reduce the risk, not only improve biodiversity and the natural environment for these species, but also, do something for ourselves. So addressing the wildlife trade, will help future reductions in these animal vectors. The second thing that I think is important, and this is really the uber point, I guess, is that these are global issues. And you could argue that the decline in water, fresh water, the decline in the world's oceans, these are slow-moving pandemics that are actually going to have profound impacts on the future of the world. We've got a little bit more time, not many years, but we do have time. It's not months. We've got time to turn the climate situation around. We've got time to address water issues. But we have to treat them seriously, and we have to do the things that are necessary in order for us to be successful there. So to me, it's a kind of an early warning and a reminder that global things can impact the world. We are so interconnected now. The climate is interconnected, and the way people move is interconnected. Our economies are interconnected, and so we're foolish not to recognize that all of the issues around nature's systems are just as important to the future of the world, and we've got to do the right thing around investing in their sustainability and in new ways of engaging with nature if we're going to avoid just catastrophic problems for all of civilization.
One of the arguments always against doing these sustainable is that it's going to cost a lot of jobs. That if you get rid of coal mines, you're going to wipe out all of West Virginia and all the coal miners. And that you're going to lose more economically than you're going to gain some small incremental improvement in the environment. You have to kind of put a financial value on ecosystems, and people say that's going to harm the economically vulnerable more than it's going to help them. What is your response to that?
Well, there are already 10 times more people in the United States employed by the solar industry than there are coal miners. Last I checked, there were only 80,000 coal miners in the entire United States, and there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of new workers who are working on wind towers, on solar energy, and the like. So some of the best, opportunities for job creation are in these new technologies. Think of the thousands of people that Tesla now employs in their factories. Think of the follow-on opportunities with their new battery plant. These are all great new job creation, and we need to pivot our economy. You can't save certain types of industries who are not fundamentally sustainable. That's just the reality of the world. So change is hard, and I feel for the impacts on individual people. But you just can't continue to do things that are fundamentally at odds with the survivability of the rest of the world. So it's about us all, taking the steps we need to transform our economy, and that will mean some dislocation, and that's the role of government. I mean, let me give you one example of this that I think is important for us to be sobered about. Many of you might recall that in France they've had this what's called the yellow shirt movement.
Yes,
there's been a lot of protest in France
because they were raising taxes for carbon taxes.
Raising taxes on energy.
Right.
This was part of France's plan to reduce the dependence on gasoline and thereby reduce climate impacts. unfortunately, when you increase the price of gasoline, who gets hurt the most? All those poor people who have to commute long distances to their jobs in the city center because they can't afford
truck drivers or other people depending on gas, correct? Right.
Yeah, exactly. So all of that impact is significant on those people, and they rightfully said, look, I mean, you're trying to solve this climate problem on the backs of the poorest people in France. So this is what can go wrong. Okay, if you don't pay attention to the safety net, and you don't say, well, how can we, incentivize people to, use less gasoline in a way that doesn't, undermine their sustainability of their lives. And so, we have to solve the climate problem, but when we do it, we need to make sure that, we have subsidies so that people can buy more efficient cars, poor people can buy more efficient cars. We need to have subsidies that take some of the money that we collect from these extra taxes and bring it back to poor people so that they can offset the increased costs. This is about how we, execute on the public policy around these issues. And this will be the issue in the U.S. When we impose a carbon tax, as ultimately we're going to have to do to incentivize people to shift away, we have to do it in a way that puts that money back into the hands of people who have been most impacted, and unfairly, not due to any action on their own. They're poor. They have a long way to go in a car and transport. And, we have to help people make that transition in order for the world to be successful in addressing climate change. And it's the same with coal miners. They need jobs. They have families. It's important. It's not going to be in coal much longer. And the reality is the reason why the coal industry has declined is that it's not competitive with solar. It's not competitive with wood. It's dirty. It's got a lot of waste attached to it. And, the big electric utilities, not because, we told them to do so because it was important for the environment, they're shifting away from coal because it just doesn't pay. It's just not, a viable source of energy anymore because of the cost of it. Well, we need to acknowledge that, and we need to do what we can to help people who are going to be impacted by those things. That's the social safety net that's going to be important in making, the public care about this work.
Very good. We're going to take another break. This is Jordan Goodman of the Money Answer Show. My guest this hour, Bill Ginn, is a business strategy consultant. He was at the Nature Conservancy as Chief Conservation Officer, one of the founders of NatureVest, the author of a new book called Valuing Nature, a Handbook for Impact Investing. You can find out at their website of the publisher, islandpress.org. We'll be back after this.
You've been listening to the Money Answer Show with Jordan Goodman. If you have a question for Jordan or his guest, please call us now at 866-472-5790. That's 866-472-5790. Now back to Jordan.
Welcome back to the Money Answer Show. This is Jordan Goodman, your host. My guest this hour is Bill Ginn. He's the founder of NatureVest, also the author of a new book called Valuing Nature, a Handbook for Impact Investing. Welcome back to the show, Bill.
Thanks, Jordan. Glad to be here.
Let's go to two examples. Fisheries. What has been some examples in using investment to make fisheries more efficient and still be profitable?
Yeah, so, I mentioned at the beginning of the show that, the fate of the world's oceans is really under enormous pressure, and fisheries are declining everywhere across the world because we're overfishing. We're not using sustainable practices to harvest the food from the ocean that we need, and we need it for people for the long run. So a few years ago, the Nature Conservancy had the opportunity to purchase the ground fishing licenses that along the California coast. And in a relatively short period of time, we acquired the fishing rights for a substantial portion of the fishery. We became the second largest owner of those rights. Now, a lot of people, because it was the Nature Conservancy, thought, well, they're just going to take those rights and they're going to, make it into a park. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. One is, we need to transform the fishing industry, not eliminate it. And these rights, if you don't use them, expire, and someone else, can apply for them and take them up. So we set out a much different and I think bolder course, which was to go back to the fishing industry and say, I tell you what, now that we own these licenses, we would like to lease them to you at a low cost, but we'll do so only if you're willing to fish sustainably. And that ended up in an enormous conversation with all these fishing communities who initially were suspicious of our motives, but, they're businessmen too, and they looked at the licenses that we were offering and the strings that were attached to them. You must fish sustainably. And we ended up with a number of really important partnerships in communities all up and down the California coast. And over a period of about 10 years, we have completely transformed that fishery to a high-value fishery, one that fishes around sustainability principles, that collaborates and works together in order to maximize the value of the fishery while they are operating it in a sustainable way and selling their products, by the way, at a premium because they are sustainable. So it was by partnering with the private sector that we were able to help them transform themselves rather than just putting them out of business. And we think that's an example of how you can pivot.
And let's talk about agriculture as well. What have you done in the agriculture area to make that more sustainable?
Well, it's really an important area, and, we need let me give you just one example. This is a global example. Much of the soybeans of the world are grown in places like the Amazon basin. And many farmers have historically gone in and cleared sections of the Amazon in exchange, for more fields. But they have a problem in that they need capital and they need, seeds and fertilizer and the like. So we created a joint venture with a major European bank and with Bunge, who is one of the principal buyers of soybeans, to provide ready credit to farmers in the Amazon basin. But that credit had loan covenants or restrictions on it. That restrictions included they can't use the money and they can't operate in such a manner that increases the amount of rainforest harvesting that they already conduct in their business. So by using basically conditions on loans, we are sending a powerful economic message to those farmers. If you want credit, if you want to have money for seed and fertilizer to expand your operations, then you have to utilize best practices, and that means not clearing more rainforest, but improving your productivity. So it's just one example of how using the financial systems, loans, we're able to transform how agriculture actually operates.
Excellent. In about 2 minutes we have left, are you overall optimistic or pessimistic about the value of these impact compared to the size of the problem in the globe?
I think this is one of the greatest business opportunities in the history of the world. We are going to transform how we use energy. We're going to transform agriculture. We're going to transform how we use water. These are fundamental, opportunities. And I think entrepreneurs around the world are already waking up to the fact that this is a big opportunity for them. So I'm optimistic. I think that the private sector is not only going to see these opportunities, but they're going to prosper. And there will be new businesses, new opportunities, new ways of doing things that will be more profitable than the past. And that will be the result of the kind of invention and entrepreneurial spirit that comes in the private sector. So I'm optimistic. I think it's the right way to go.
Very good. It's good to end on an optimistic note. My guest this hour has been Bill Ginn. He was formerly the Chief Conservation Officer at the Nature Conservancy. He helped found NatureVest, which is a partnership with private investors that has brought in over $1 billion into investment in conservation projects, like he's talked about. And he's the author of a new book called Valuing Nature, a Handbook for Impact Investing. That's published by Island Press, which you can find out about islandpress.org. Thanks so much for being on the Money Answer Show. I think people learned a lot, Bill.
Thanks, Jordan. My pleasure.
Thanks again. We'll be back next week with another edition of the Money Answer Show. Goodbye for now.
Thank you for joining Jordan Goodman and the Money Answer Show. If you have a question for Jordan, please visit his website at www.moneyanswers.com. And be sure to tune in every Monday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time right here on Voice America Business. See you next week.